Welcome to All About Agatha, the podcast dedicated to reading and ranking every single mystery novel written by the Queen of Crime, Dame Agatha Christie. I am Kemper Donovan, and on this episode, I am bringing you an interview that I did with YA mystery author Maureen Johnson. This is not Maureen's first time on the podcast. It's her second time on the podcast, but she is one of my favorite authors currently writing YA mystery. And this is officially the second episode in my ongoing series about YA mystery, a topic near and dear to many of your hearts, and certainly to mine, and certainly to Maureen's. And while we're on the topic of hearts, it feels strange mere days after an extremely consequential election here in the United States, not to mention that my heart feels very heavy. I know that Maureen's does as well. She is very outspoken politically on social media, so I'm not divulging anything you couldn't easily find out yourself. This is also not a political podcast, so I will leave it at that. But I wanted to acknowledge that this is a hard time for some people out there. For others, it's not. But if it is, I hope that this interview helps you a little bit. At the very least, by way of diversion, but perhaps by way of engagement, which would be even better. And now, let's get on with the interview. The author Maureen Johnson came onto this podcast nearly 2 years ago at the end of 2022 to discuss the Truly Devious series, her fabulous set of YA mysteries featuring her teen detective protagonist, Stevie Bell. There are currently 5 novels in that series, and Maureen is back this year with a standalone mystery titled Death at Morning House. It came out toward the end of this summer, so it is currently available for purchase. One of my favorite things about the Truly Devious series was the way you could tell it was inspired by Maureen's love of classic mysteries, specifically Agatha Christie mysteries. And happily, this love is very much on display. If anything, it's more on display in Death at Morning House. So I am super excited to talk about this book and also to talk about YA mystery in general, which is a topic that we have been unspooling here on the podcast. Welcome, Maureen.
Thank you so much for having me again. I'm so happy to be here. I feel like this is warm and friendly water to swim in. It's so like, yes, all about yes. Yes, here we go.
You're now in the sort of select group of repeat podcast guests. And
thank you.
There's a really good reason for that, because again, there's so much to talk about here vis-a-vis Agatha Christie and mystery. So first, I'd love to give listeners a sense of what Death at Morning House is about. And fortunately, Maureen has an excellent publicist who gave me one of those little inserts about the book and the author that you sometimes get with an early copy of a book. And there's a pretty great synopsis in there. So I'm just going to read it now, unless you would like to do a synopsis of your own book, Maureen.
Oh, here's the thing. As someone who's been doing this a long time, I should be able to do that really well. Like I should be able to, and here's how it actually turns out. Wrote this book and it's a mystery. And so, yeah, please feel free, because nobody wants the weird meandering pitch that I have.
One of the few insights I think that I can bring, having now, published a book of my own, or a couple of books of my own, is exactly that. I almost never force authors on this podcast to summarize their own books, because it's just a disaster. Like it doesn't matter how good you are at summarizing other people's books. When it's your own stuff, it's a nightmare. So I will take that nightmare out of your hands. And here is just a little rundown here. Death at Morning House features Marlo Wexler, a queer teen who, unlike Stevie Bell from the Truly Devious series, is not a detective. Heartbroken after a disastrous date, she finds herself in a summer job working at a grand but dilapidated house on an island in northern New York at the Canadian border. It's there she stumbles upon 2 mysteries, one in the present day and one kept concealed since the 1930s. And this book really does have it all, listeners. It has multiple murders in 2 separate timelines. It has a disappearance. It has hidden treasure. It has not 1, but 2 fires. Truly something.
Extra fire.
Yeah, extra fire.
Bonus
Truly
fire.
Something for everyone. And just as in the Truly Devious series, the story is set both in the present day and in the past. And our present day characters end up solving not only the present day mystery, but the past mystery as well. And this is something we spoke about a little bit the first time you were on the podcast, but solving murders from the past is something that Agatha Christie did a lot. Dumb Witness, Five Little Pigs, Sparkling Cyanide, Ordeal by Innocence, Nemesis, Elephants Can Remember, Sleeping Murder. There are even more than that, but it's
was beautiful. The way you rattled those off.
Thank you. It's a very Christie-ish thing to do. And I actually I rattled them off for a reason, because I want to do another Christie-ish thing, which is I hid a key reference there within my laundry list of titles. I want to pluck out one of those titles from the laundry list that I just went through, because for me, there was one Christie book that you seem to be referencing in Death at Morning House more than any other. And it's not just as to investigating a past crime. And that book is Ordeal by Innocence. So both your and Christie's books have a similar sort of setup, extreme setup here, in that we're presented at the start of the story with a large family of adopted children. In Ordeal by Innocence, it's the Argyle family. There's 5 children who are adopted by the matriarch Rachel Argyle and her husband Leo. And then in your book, and this is the past storyline, so this is the storyline that takes place in the 1930s, which our contemporary teen is sort of investigating and ultimately solving, along with murders that take place in her timeline. But in your book, it's the Ralston family, which is made up of 7 children, 6 of them adopted by the patriarch, Dr. Philip Ralston. And in the same way that Christie has a lot of, shall we say, thoughts about Rachel's choices when it comes to child rearing, you definitely have a lot of thoughts about the various philosophies that Dr. Ralston brings to his paternal duties, including the racist and classist ideology of eugenics, which was very much in vogue in the 1930s. That's something that also comes up in Christie, actually, perhaps most notably in Curtain. There's a whole big conversation about eugenics in that book.
Is there?
There is, yeah. It's not one of those stuck in their time references either. I mean, it's definitely mentioned in a disapproving sort of way within the book. And we'll talk more about stuck in their time later. But I'm curious whether you were drawing on Ordeal by Innocence consciously at all when you were writing this book.
No. There's another Christie book, actually, that I was thinking about a lot that I can't mention because it's a major spoiler alert. But there is a...
Yes. Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm talking about?
I sure do.
Okay. Yeah, there's another one that I thought about a lot that I think if anyone who reads Christie and reads this will be like, it's not referencing, but it's certainly a nod. That's all I can say. It's real. I have to be careful because that one's real spoilery. It has to do with the solution.
Yeah, I was careful not to mention that one because I think that's...
Or did he? Or did he?
Or did he? It's true.
To throw you off.
It's a tough one to mention, especially if your audience are, avid Christie readers, as this audience is, because I think if we mention that book, and I don't think I'm spoiling anything even by saying this, because there are a couple of, there are a number of Christies that hinge on major high concepts. And I think if you say, oh, it's in the vein of that, then it's going to spoil your book. And I don't want to spoil your book for anyone. So I'm going to hold off on mentioning what book that is, unless maybe I did in my laundry list, or maybe I didn't. Who
knows?
You'll have to read the book to find out.
I think it's really interesting that you brought up Ordeal by Innocence, because I wasn't thinking that, but I think I was, because I carry around this happy bag of Christie bits and thoughts in my head. There's lots of, like, for example, the drug Veronal comes up a lot.
Yes.
And Veronal is obviously super popular in Christie.
Yes.
And as I remember, because I watched 13 at dinner, the Peter Ustinov.
Yes, Lord Edgeworth Dies, and that's the one.
Oh, sorry,
where, no, but it is called 13 at Dinner because they use the American title.
Right.
That's the one. When I was reading your book and I came across Veronal, it is in a couple of other titles as well, but that's the most memorable one because I always think of Lord Edgeworth Dies,
where he goes Veronal. And David Suchet does it well. It does it as too. Just the way they always Veronal. They find it in a case, and just the way they take it out and look at it, it's stuck in my head from the time I was a kid. Just the way they pluck it out of that case. Veronal. So Veronal is in it. A big drug of the time. But no, I wasn't thinking about Ordeal by Innocence. I wanted to pull in actual concepts of real misdeeds of the American 1930s, of which there were, there's lots to choose from, but there's a couple references to a few bad actors and concepts that were presented as incredibly wholesome. That you had that, like, for example, the concept of eugenics wasn't only in vogue, it was You could go to a state fair, get yourself your corn dog, and then go next door to the eugenics cabin, tent, and get your baby's head measured. That was just a thing. That's an absolute, like, there were so many things like that were just, we don't want to say like, oh, well, we don't talk about that. No, you have to learn that this was accepted, quote unquote, science, that this was just as common as when you're at the state fair level. I think that you're pretty like diffuse throughout the society.
Yes.
But yeah, just things that we considered very wholesome. There's a couple historical figures, but Philip Ralston is this very stand-up guy. He's famous for being such a good guy, a doctor. He adopted all these. He went to World War I. He was a doctor. He saved all these orphaned babies from the war and brought them back. So all of these 6 older kids are almost all the same age. So he has 6 children that are basically the same age.
Yes.
Living together. And their summer house, this all takes place on an island in the Thousand Islands. And they build a mansion on the island, which people did. That was like the playground of the rich, the Thousand Islands up above, just sort of above Syracuse, New York. That area between New York and Canada is this scattering of 1,800 islands. And you can buy one and you could build a mansion on it. And they did. And they would just yacht from island to island all summer. And there are a bunch of abandoned castles and mansions up there.
Have you spent time there, by the way? Because
I did go up there, yeah.
Yeah. But did you go up specifically for
just for this
book? Yeah.
And it's amazing because some of those islands only have a single tiny house on them and no ground around them. Imagine just a house floating on an island. And this is a huge river. I mean, it's deep. It's a shipping channel. It's huge. And it's got a heavy current and it's extremely pure and clear. And the water almost looks tropical. It kind of glows green and people just boat from, I had a contact up there, a teenager who was a tour guide on one of the boats I was on. And I was like, can I ask you questions? And, she told me things like, yeah, I take a jet ski to work. That's how I get to work. It's like, I am living my life wrong. Like, that's amazing. If I was a teenager who was jet skiing to work, I'd be a different person right now. So maybe it's good that I had the past I did, but man, that sounds amazing. This is my island book. How many, aside from And Then There Are None, does she do any other island ones? I mean, certainly
Evil Under the Sun.
Evil Under the Sun, because the hotel.
Another. Yeah, it's basically Burr Island, which was just off of the coast of Devon where she lived. That's sort of it's a little bit the inspiration for the island in And Then There Were None, but it's much more recognizably that island.
Right. Is that the one where can you pass the channel sometimes and other times you can't? Is that it? Or I
yes,
can't quite remember.
And they have that. Yes, and the Suchet adaptation is set on the actual Burr Island, and they have that tractor that he gets on, which kind of goes through. It's that like tidal tractor where you get up really high and you kind of wade through the water. That is all real. And I believe that they just reopened the hotel because there's a hotel on the island. I know, which I would love to go to. It was up for sale recently. That was the other thing. I mean, the whole island, all of Burr Island was up for sale. And I guess someone bought it and now they've reopened the hotel that was there. But yes, I mean, an island it's a very external and extreme way to set up a closed circle situation. It's interesting to me because I think the sort of the DNA of what you're doing here in the Truly Devious series is very similar. They feel like sibling books because they both involve a contemporary storyline with a teen protagonist. And then this very, sort of extreme situation in the past, in the 1930s, both, right, that are, have to be investigated by our present day characters. And you're sort of elucidating what's happening by way of third person narration from the past, in addition to, a closer sort of first person narration in the present from our teen protagonist, which feels more traditionally YA, but it's like you're getting to do both of those things at the same time. I'm curious, why is that a setup that you wanted to return to that works so well for you? What are you getting out of this, Maureen?
You know what? What are you doing? This question has come up a bunch since this book has been out, and I knew I was doing it. It wasn't like I was like, look what I did, but I couldn't have really told you why. Because I hadn't really thought about it. I just knew that it felt in the composition of me. I was like, this is really how I like to do this. So I have been thinking about it a lot. One is that I love classic mysteries and that kind of thing. Like I just love it. And I would love to solve, I'm like, where is my 1930s unsolved situation?
Sure. Mm-hmm.
It's more possible to solve a case like that in the past because it doesn't involve as much, this isn't going to be like we're looking for DNA, because it's either going to be degraded or everything. Because all those old past crime scenes are incredibly contaminated. I mean, clearly, every time they had a crime scene, they're like, everybody get in here, touch everything.
Yes.
They just really wanted to, as much as possible, make that thing as soupy as possible. Contamination, baby, that's what we're after. So the only way you can solve it is really things like documents, photographs, just kind of tactile puzzle pieces that a reader, a person in the present, can actually put together.
Sure.
So it's like a Poirot. You can be Poirot. You can be like, I have found a scrap in the fire. There and all. Just you have a shot at finding the documents. You have a shot at unearthing the box. You have a shot at finding something at the attic. And also, I think just the bigger thing that writing from a place of things that make you mad, or even better, slightly annoy you. I'm a big believer in that a slight peeve can inspire you to do like that really annoys me. I'm going to write something the opposite of it. Mysteries in history are, aside from it sort of sounding alike, they are sort of the same thing. You are looking at little tiny pieces of bits of information, trying to figure out how we got to where we are now. Mm-hmm. Whether or not it's like you're digging up pieces of a clay pot and you're trying to work out from those clay pot pieces, this was made in Turkey, but why is it here in Greece? And what did it contain? Olives. And that tells us something about trade routes. And that tells us something about growing conditions. And that tells us something about what people were eating and doing. And like, you can get a lot of information from that clay pot. Likewise, you have to take that little bit of, the scraps in the fire and try to figure out why someone is dead. So it's just always kind of going back and sifting through a pile of stuff and trying to figure out how the hell we ended up where we are right now.
Yeah.
So part of this book is about like the mess, these things from the past that are in our American past. It's like, this is a giant mess. And it tells us something about why we are here now. But also it will tell you who the murderer is.
I think that's really interesting. Yeah. Sorry.
There's a reason that Christie was interested in archaeology. Like she wants to pick through the pieces and figure it out.
That's so interesting. I never thought about it exactly that way, but I think you're right. I mean, on one hand, I think it allows you to almost like tamp down on the forensic requirements of obviously of the investigation. But what that allows you to do is then focus a little bit on the intuiting of not just plot, but character too, because I think that's the other thing. I think a lot of the mystery in Death at Morning House, just as in the case of Christie, it hinges on character, or in that, okay, well, we know that this Dr. Ralston is the kind of person who he has gone whole hog for eugenics. Like he is just fully, and this has sort of been one of the, foundational philosophies of his family. Well, is that going to perhaps create a problem? Right. What exactly is that going to lead to? I mean, I think that the detective work is really on that sort of a character level. And I was going to bring this up actually a little later, but I'm just going to bring it up now because I think it's so relevant. One of the other things I loved about this book is that there's a running, aside from the Christie references, there's a running reference throughout the book to The Daughter of Time by Josephine Kay.
Yes.
So this is a detective novel. Many listeners will know all of this, so forgive me. But this is a detective novel from 1951. My former partner, Catherine Brobick, and I, we actually covered it many years ago on our Patreon account as a bonus episode. It was one of her favorite novels. I had never read it before, so we read it together, and I absolutely loved it. It takes the armchair detective sort of subgenre and ratchets it up to 11 because the detective is literally confined to a bed as he recovers from a broken leg. I mean, he cannot move. And over the course of the novel, he sets about to solve one of the coldest cases ever. Could you just explain, I'll stop talking now, could you explain a little bit what The Daughter of Time is about? What is the case that he is solving and how you use the book in Death at Morning House?
The detective in Daughter of Time, he was chasing a suspect, and I think he fell through a floor. And he was like in a dust search, falls through the floor, has this bad leg break, So this is the 1950s. He's in the hospital and there's nothing to do. Truly, he is his legs up in traction, and he has been looking at the cracks in the ceiling and trying to find patterns in them. That's what he's been doing with all of his time. And he has various friends that come by and are trying to bring him books and just things to keep him entertained. And he's just had it. The poor man doesn't have a phone or a TV. He's got nothing. So his friend proposes, look, you need something to do. So I want you to figure out if Richard III really killed the princes in the tower, his nephews, in order to become king, which is pretty much, one of the greatest cold case of all time. Who killed, what happened to the princes? There were two princes. One of them was, I guess, technically King Edward the Sixth.
You got me.
One of them. It was an Edward or a Henry. Was he a Henry? I can't remember. It was an Edward or a Henry. He was technically, he was going to be king. He was king. And they disappeared. They were about 11 years old. And no one has, they were eventually, I think they were found, bodies were found buried in the tower that appeared to be them in the floor. And the thought has been for hundreds of years, did Richard III murder those children? Because with them gone, he then became king as their uncle. So in order to solve this, the friend keeps bringing him different types of books. So the first thing he gets is the painting of him. There's one very famous painting of Richard III, and he stares at the painting endlessly, trying to just drink every piece of information that is being presented, why the artist has painted him this way, what the world thinks of him, and then every possible research book. And then he combines and tries to read between the lines of all these accounts of what people are saying or not saying, and who was most likely to have actually killed the princes. It is something. And it's about looking back at the portrayal of people at the time and what information you're actually told about their goodness, their badness, I don't want to give away too much, but it's about looking back. And truly, you're only allowed to do certain things if you're Josephine Tey, in my opinion. Somebody brought up somebody was like, I'm going to put twins in a murder mystery. And I leaned across the table and I was like, you do not put twins in unless you're Josephine Tey. She's the only one allowed to do twins because she didn't write many books, but they're all masterpieces. That's what's crazy about them.
Yes.
Like every one of them is like, okay, you win. I guess you win.
Totally agree.
But Daughter of Time is one of those. And also, I will say, reading it back, it's a tough read in some places because I get swamped in the Edwards and the Richards because they only have a couple names. They're either Edward, Richard, Henry, or Anne, and that's basically it. And there's some Margarets, and then you just have to keep all your Margarets and Henrys and Edwards straight. And sometimes it makes me feel like I'm going to go nuts. But yes, you should read it if you haven't read it. It's amazing. And if you have, you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, no, I mean, I don't get to air my love of Josephine Tey too often on this podcast. I mean, in some ways, there's no reason to pit Agatha Christie against Josephine Tey.
No.
But they're very different mystery writers, though. I mean, down to Josephine Tey didn't write that many mysteries. Agatha Christie wrote so many, but Josephine Tey is often doing something different. I mean, one of my very favorite novels, I have mentioned this before, is Miss Pym Disposes. I love that novel so much. And Daughter of Time, yes. I mean, it is a static investigation, and at times the static nature of that investigation is reflected in the, a little bit of narrative flatness, shall we say, on the page. But it's still just fascinating. And especially for anyone who's read or watched Shakespeare's Richard III, which gets a ton of, I guess there's kind of, if anyone is the culprit for perhaps the wrong way that we are thinking about Richard III, it's Shakespeare. But yes, I mean, I think it goes to the heart of what you're doing here because it's about who is telling the story, how are they presenting not only certain facts, but just the way that certain people are, because that's everything, right? I mean, the narrative power is sort of everything, especially when you're investigating something in the past. And you really put the reader, I mean, what I love is, like the Truly Devious Mysteries, this is a fair play mystery in that you are putting the reader on notice at several points throughout the book, and including in the very beginning, because we open up with these two newspaper accounts. And the first one is this fluff piece about this wonderful family, the Ralston family, and their 6 adopted children. And there's this, seventh boy the father and mother had biologically, and just they're all so wonderful and accomplished. And they live on this wonderful morning house in this island. And it's also wonderful and perfect. And then the next article is a notice like right after that, I forget exactly how I can look it up right now because I have the book.
It's within the first 2 pages. Yeah.
Yes. So the first article is in Life magazine from July 1932. And then the next is just this little notice from the New York Times, July 28th, 1932. So literally weeks after, if not days after that piece is published, talking about tragedy having befallen this very family because 2 of the children who we were just introduced to in that fluff piece are dead. I'm laughing, not in a sadistic way, and so just from the start, you're like, oh, okay. So all is not as it seems. And that's obviously foundational to any mystery. People are not as they appear, but the ways in which I think, you're playing around with the notion of narrative control is just really interesting. And I love that you use Daughter of Time as a classic example of that, because our teen protagonist, she's reading Daughter of Time as she's kind of trying to figure all this stuff out. And that's what she gleans from it, that, well, we can't always be sure about the way someone was, especially from the past, because who is actually telling us that story? Who is the one feeding us the information? Do they have an agenda, et cetera, et cetera? Don't touch that dial. We'll be back in a moment with the rest of our episode. We just wanted to take a moment to ask you, our dear listeners, for a favor.
If you haven't already done so, we would very much appreciate it if you take a moment to, give us a rating or a review wherever you're listening to this podcast.
It really helps the podcast out because ratings and reviews make it much easier for other Christie fans such as yourselves to find our podcast.
And the more ratings and reviews we get, the more people we can reach.
It should take you a matter of seconds, and lucky you, we're going to provide you with those seconds right now, so go to it.
Thank you so much. And now, back to our regularly scheduled programming.
I actually want to talk just a little bit about your teen protagonist and specifically about her name.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot to unpack here. So her name is Marlo Wexler.
Yeah.
What I love about this name is that it's the first name that overwhelms us here with its mystery-ish-ness, to coin an extremely awkward word, because Marlowe is obviously a reference to Raymond Chandler's detective Philip Marlowe. You even spelled it the same way. There's an E at the end. So, we see this name, we're thinking Humphrey Bogart in The Big Sleep, Elliot Gould in The Long Goodbye. Like, it's all very mystery-ish. That's fantastic. But in a way, I feel like you're using misdirection here because it is actually Marlowe's last name that, for me, was the key when we're talking about mystery-ishness. And I sort of squealed in delight. It was an inside
I'm so happy.
squeal. Yeah,
I'm so happy that you knew.
Oh, I knew. I was using my inside voice. My inner pig was squealing with delight when I saw that you gave your protagonist the last name Wexler, because I know, I'm not even asking, I know that has to be a reference to Tabitha Ruth Alice, a.k.a. Turtle Wexler,
100%.
the 13-year-old protagonist of YA mystery classic The Westing Game by Ellen Raskin. So I'm just going to go out on a limb here and guess that you are a fan of The Westing Game.
If I could have the entirety of that book tattooed on my back, I would do it. I mean, that was, that book was everything to me. Like, as a kid, I just could not believe it existed. I mean, I can still tell you sort of everything I felt just like reading that book, just thinking about Sunset Towers, just thinking, just the way that book begins, the sun sets in the west, but Sunset Towers face east. Interesting, or something. That's like, those are something I've wrongly said the first 2 sentences, but right from the beginning, you get this little spicy, like, something's wrong. Like, the building faces the wrong way. There's a lie. There's a lie immediately. You're being told a lie.
Yeah.
And the fact that this girl, 13-year-old girl, has to play this game with all these adults and figure out all these. If you haven't read it, what are you doing? Go read it. Like, it's foundational. Oh,
It is.
Oh, my heart.
It is foundational. I'm actually going to do an episode centered on the Westing game. Because we're doing, I mean, this very episode is one among a series that I'm doing on sort of YA mystery. I happen to have read the Westing game recently with my 7-year-old daughter. And I've mentioned this to listeners before. It's come up in the recent past, but we read it actively. I sort of used it as an opportunity to mentor her and like how to actively read a mystery. We kept a clue notebook. Like we figured out most of the mystery because I actually didn't. I mean, I had read it a long time ago and I didn't.
It's tough.
It's really tough. Here's the thing. I mean, the reason that I think the Westing game is such a classic is that the puzzle at its core is truly tricky. Like there are at least 2 extremely clever tricks that the reader has to figure out to understand what's happening in the book. And yet Ellen Raskin, she lays it all out there. She really does give the reader all of the tools to figure out what's happening, but it is tough. So it's a classic puzzle mystery. It's a fair play mystery. And I do think that there's a lot of mystery out there, YA and otherwise, that pretends to do this, but doesn't really do it. And you are someone who obviously enjoys a good puzzle mystery, both as a reader and an author. I'm curious if you have, I mean, I'm asking for myself and also for future episodes on the podcast. I'm curious if you have any other recommendations or favorite YA books, either classic or contemporary, who do what Ellen Raskin does in the Westing game, and which you also largely do in your books.
I try to. I mean, can I just tell you one? This just because you're the audience for this, I just want to give one flex. This is the only flex I've got. Can I just do it?
Please.
This is. I didn't mention this for a long time, but I think it's been so long now I can't. There was going to be, the family wanted the sequel written. They had notes from her, and I was approached to do it. Yes.
Oh my God.
And I considered it. I paced frantically, like my heart was aflutter. And I turned it down because ultimately I didn't think it should be done. Because I've seen, like, I have feelings about work that's been continued on from other writers and how it never quite does what, unless you're VC Andrews, who is 90 people, you know, like,
right.
But, or, you
unless
know,
you were many people from the beginning. Yes. Yeah.
Right. But it just wasn't, I mean, it was like one of those things where I was like, thank you, but like, I don't think it should be done.
You can just die right now. Like that is the ultimate compliment to even have been approached.
Yeah, that was some time ago, and they never. And ultimately, no one did it. Like I think that there were conflicts with the family and like getting it all, making it happen. But she had notes for another book.
Wow.
And I didn't see them because I turned it down. But yeah,
that's really interesting. Within the world of like Turtle, like was it the same?
No, I think it was a totally different book.
A different book, yeah, which makes sense.
No,
the Westing game, like
actually, I can't answer that because I don't know. Like it may have involved Turtle because it was a sequel, so it would have involved some of those people. But I just know it was like it was a sequel to it, and there were notes. But that's all I know, and I don't really know how it was supposed to work.
I mean, because the Westing game is, and I'll talk about this more on the episode that's devoted to it. But the other thing that I found, especially on this last read with my daughter about the Westing game, that was so remarkable is that the characters are so 3-dimensional, obviously, but also like the story is so full and complete. I mean, she really ends it. Like there's, you go into the future. At the very end of the book, you jump in time, and she really tells you like exactly what happens to all of these people, and she wraps it up. You know, so I would share your trepidation. I mean, I think it's one of those like, do you really want to mess with that? You know,
I think it jumps because Turtle's 13. And then it jumps to when she's like
an adult. Yeah.
She's an adult. And I think she's a lawyer, and she's walking into someone's office. And so she's probably, I would guess 28 or so. Like I would say it jumps about 15 years.
Yeah. Yeah. So I guess you could have a sequel when she's an adult or something, but it's so perfect. I mean, the Westing game as a standalone novel is pretty perfect. So I would,
and there's a lot
worry about that.
It stands up in a lot of ways that, like, sometimes you go and you reread stuff and you go, ooh, yeesh, yikes. Less so with the Westing game.
It is a book that also, and I'm going to ask you about this as well, but I mean, it was a book that was, I think you can tell that she really made an effort to have diversity within the cast of characters. It is very inclusive. She talks about a lot of different things. And I will say, there was only one passage that when I was reading it to my daughter, who sometimes we read it out and then we talk about it. Sometimes I just choose to skip over some stuff because it's just not the right time. And there was only one thing that I skipped over. And that's pretty good for a book from 1978. That's choosing to deal with a lot of these sorts of, with a diverse cast and a lot of heady issues, let's say.
Right.
She definitely acquits herself extremely well.
Yeah, this group of people has been brought together to solve a puzzle. And it's a very interesting group of people. It's both children and adults and teenagers. Like they've been placed together on purpose.
Yes, it's not just like Turtle and then a bunch of adults. It's true. There's a lot, like, there's a bunch of like teenage boys. There's like teenage boys, and then Turtle's older sister, who's like kind of on the cusp. You know, she is an adult, but hasn't figured her way out, yet into, what her adulthood is going to be. And
Angela's probably 19 or so, right? Like
exactly.
She's about to get married, but she is young and
she's young. She might be 22. Like she might be, because I think she did go to college, because she's lost touch with all of her college friends, because basically her mother has chosen a different path for her that has diverged from her college friends, and perhaps she'll write her course by the end of the novel. But this actually leads me into my next question, because I think also one of the reasons that The Westing Game is a classic of YA fiction is that so many of those characters are struggling with, who do I want to be? What am I going to make of my life? And the adults struggle with that just as much as the children do. But I think there's something about it that feels so relevant when you're a kid reading that book. And I wanted to ask you about this, and this is sort of part of the larger series that I'm doing on YA mystery, but your books are they're certainly marketed as YA, and they're geared toward teenagers, but they are enjoyed by a lot of adults. I count myself as one of those adults. And I think you could almost say the inverse is true for Christie. Her books were never written or marketed as anything other than adult fiction. And we know this because the one time a collection of hers was marketed as YA, she was very grumpy about it, and she made her displeasure known. And yet they're always eternally enjoyed by a lot of kids. A lot of people first discovered Christie when they're children. I've talked about this endlessly on the podcast. And I'd love to know what you see as the dividing line between YA mystery and adult mystery, how blurry that line may be. Does the line even exist at all? I just like, what makes a mystery an adult mystery versus a YA mystery beyond the age of the person who happens to be reading it?
The age of the protagonist, I think, is really what the line is. So there really isn't. It's less of a line and more of a field. Just that in YA, the protagonist is going to be under 18, and that's about it. I mean, that's really all the difference is. You're being told a story. You're being guided through the perspective of someone who is not an adult, and the things you tend to get from that are firsts. So your YA protagonist is never going to be, in fact, Marlowe makes a joke about this, that it's like, I have all these ex-wives somewhere, like you don't see that, like that's my joke about YA is that they're not like, I got all these ex-wives. I got 2 more weeks on the job. Like that's not a YA protagonist, but the world is the same world because the world is the world. Or any world that's being created. It's like, it's a person under the age of 18 in the world, a world. And it's going to usually be first love. It's usually going to be first job. It's usually going to be first heartbreak. It's usually going to be first bunch of fires or first dates or first, and it just so happens that these characters, so I wanted to do the two kinds, I wanted to do detective series. So Stevie Bell is the series detective who is a detective who wants to be a detective who moves through a series of cases. But I also wanted to do a standalone because we also like a standalone closed loop mystery. And Marlowe has no intention of being a detective, despite her name being Two Detectives. That was my doing, not hers. And she just wants to sort of like go on a date, eat ice cream, figure out high school, she's
and not burn a house down.
And not burn a house down. She burns she goes on a very disastrous date and ends up in this place where she is not happy about, she's a little bit like, I think someone is dead. And I feel like that's a problem I'm going to have to deal with. So she is not a detective So I had to think about that a lot when I was creating Stevie, because she can't have a bunch of ex-wives and, a bunch of, one more case. She's not Jake. This isn't Chinatown. How do you make a 16-year-old a detective? Now, in Marlo's case, I just picked her up and tossed her into a pile of murders. Said, figure it out, which I can do. That's my job. I can throw them anywhere I like. Get in there.
Yep.
Figure it out. That's it. That's really the only difference. It's the age of the protagonist. People often make the mistake of thinking the level of complexity of the story is different. There's every level of complexity in the level of writing and storytelling in YA as there is an adult. And I have read some adult books that are just, they're about submarines, but it's like they're for children. It's like, oh, I want to fight a submarine, and I went down and I punched it. People make the mistake of thinking like, oh, it's written for teenagers. It's simple. Do you know the kind of stuff you have to read in high school? You know what I mean? Like,
yep.
You start reading Shakespeare, you start reading, like, you go through literature and you're reading all different kinds of stuff. So yes, that's my explanation to rant on that. It's not there for everybody.
That is beautiful. I love that. I mean, it's very clarifying, and it makes so much sense, because I think you could tell when I was asking the question. I mean, for the line, I think to a certain extent exists a lot less than people think, because they start putting all those sorts of parameters on it. Well, it has to be more simply told, and it's like, no. I mean, there's all of the sort of variety that you get in adult mystery, you get in YA mystery. It is simply the age of the protagonist. That's it.
When you think about movies with like, for example, let's take Mean Girls. That's about a bunch of teenagers, the complicated interdynamics of a high school. Or one of my recent favorites, it was Booksmart, which is a wild, hilarious ride. Movies that take place in those, let's see, what Easy A, or I'm not going to go Saltburn because that's a little bit older, but it's not much older, but that's a wild ride.
Yes.
What a movie.
What a movie.
But oh boy. Oof. But the complexities of high school, the social dynamics are intense. It's like Versailles all the time in there. So, you have to be able to read people. You have to be able to read the signs. You have to be able to read the shoes, the looks, the glances, the movements. You have to measure in inches and in feet. Like, you really have to. Everyone's a detective in high school.
Right. That's a great tagline right there. And once you have a younger protagonist in that way, obviously it does affect the story, because like you said, what that means is that everything is a series of firsts, or tends to be a series of firsts, and that obviously affects the tone and even, as you're saying, sort of the investigatory aspect of it. So obviously that one difference reverberates down. But what I also love about your answer is I think it also kind of explains why there's nothing unnatural about adults reading YA fiction and about children reading adult fiction, because we all want to read stories involving protagonists who are sometimes similar to us in certain ways, but often different from us in lots of different ways. And I personally love reading stories that have protagonists who are children, because I think that's interesting. I mean, it's just one of the many ways in which a story can be interesting. So it's why you get all of this crossover, which I think people sometimes get a little up in arms about in both directions.
Right. Read whatever. It's when I think about it, when I'm sitting there, I'm a teenager, I'm reading Hemingway. Did I have a tremendous understanding of the physical limitations of the characters that have been wounded in war, and therefore, no, that's the whole point of reading. But yes, they are, and that means you have some boundaries on them, and they also get forced into situations a lot because they're told where to go. So you can send them places. Like she really, she drives an embarrassing little car. She's trying to go on a date. And then she gets really embarrassed and basically has to leave town and gets offered a job. Like, do you want this job? Like, they need someone her whole thing is she's a pretty good, she's a fast learner. And they're like, look, this place, this morning house is only opening for it. The whole thing is the house has been closed since the 1930s. Since the day this happened, that the family bugged out and that building went vacant and basically was left derelict for years, which the actual building, elements of it are based on a building called Bolt Castle on Hart Island, the most famous building in the Thousand Islands, on the islands. And it is a castle that this guy super, super rich guy built for his wife. He even resculpted the island so it looked like a heart.
Wow.
And he built a castle. And it was almost like they were basically putting up the last stuff. And his wife died. And he was like, that's it, we're out. And he just left it. And it was derelict for years. And people would carve their names. People just ripped it apart and carved their names into the walls. And when you go and you tour it, they left the top floor raw. And you can go through and see all the graffiti from decades, like 1940s graffiti, 1970s graffiti. Like it's all been preserved up there. And some places you can actually go and some places kind of covered over, and some you can actually kind of go and actually put your finger into the divots where they've carved out of the wall. So it was like a party house. And so I used a similar concept of like, it's this house that was left derelict. And then in the present day, it's been purchased by like a Republican think tank. And they've made a deal with the town that they can have it for tours for one summer. They finished it up and they're like, okay, as a gesture of goodwill to the Chamber of Commerce, you can have it. You can run tours for the summer, and then we're going to take it over. And they're short a tour guide. And through a connection through some teachers, they're like, this girl, Marlo, she's a quick learner. She gets sent up there. And you'll find out the reason they're short a tour guide is that the last one died. So,
Yeah, I mean, you've saddled this poor girl with basically 2 murders from the past and ultimately 2 murders in the present.
So, yeah, or
murder everywhere.
He had an accident. They party on islands, and he fell off during a post prom, and he drowned. Like he fell off some rocks and he died. So you don't know if it's a murder or not. I'll tell you, it was a murder.
When in doubt, it was probably murder. Just there is no dearth of murder in this book, either in the past or in the present day. I think that's actually a really good point that you can, younger protagonists are easy to move and to put into extreme circumstances like this, and you certainly go there. One of the other things that I really love about these books, about both the Truly Devious series and this book, is that you really take a lot of care, or that was my perception anyway, to populate your books with a cast of characters that features diversity in terms of race, sexual orientation, gender identity. Marlo Exler, she self-identifies as queer, for instance, and there are many trans and non-binary characters in this book and in Truly Devious, as well as people of color. I remember reflecting on this when I was discussing the new collection of Miss Marple short stories, actually, that contemporary authors have written. I did that with my friend Brad Friedman. The way that bringing these sorts of classic fair play mysteries into the 21st century by peopling them with a more inclusive cast of characters, it felt so right. It felt so joyous to me as a mystery reader. So first of all, thank you for doing this. I mean, as a kid who would go on to identify as gay, I honestly wish that I had books like this when I was growing up. I would have loved them. And they're just, there are some, but there just weren't as many. So I just think it's a wonderful thing. And I'm curious, as someone who has obviously thought long and hard about inclusion and what it means to feel alienated by a text that may not have space for you, I'd love to ask you, I'm going to ask you this dreaded question as to how you feel about the editing of texts like Christie's in terms of some of those elements that we've chosen on this podcast to call stuck in their time. I know it's a complicated issue, but I just wanted to get a sense of where you stand on it.
Whether or not to go back and change it?
Yes.
There are problems there, and it's hard. I don't really know. I honestly, this is one of those things that I'm stuck on, because I want people to be able to read the book, but you also have to know where people really stood. And I think that's part of it, is like, she had some views that are pretty gross, but they were common. And I never know what to say about it. Honestly, it's just one of those things that really flummoxes me, because I'm like, it's if you, I don't know, is the short answer. Like, it's something I would get stuck on. My instinct is always like, don't change it. Let people know what was actually there. But I don't know. What do you think? Like, I really don't know.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's something I've grappled with multiple times with lots of different people, because I think and I love the honesty of your answer, because it's my answer too, that I don't know, because I feel very firmly that if there is going to be any sort of addressing of this issue in terms of editing, that there needs to be a commitment to keeping the original texts in circulation and fully available to anyone who wants to seek them out. Like, I think that's really important, not only for scholarly reasons and sort of like, literary / like purity reasons, but just because it's also important to get a sense of what things were like and what opinions people had back then. And for purposes of how we may choose to live our lives differently or similarly now, I mean, I think if you start erasing that, that is hugely problematic. But I do understand that many people come to texts like Christie's because they want a couple of hours of diversion, and they're not necessarily coming to them because they want to be confronted with a hideous instance of anti-Semitism in a book that they're otherwise enjoying. And I understand the impulse to want to remove that so that the overall experience of reading the book is closer to what I imagine Christie intended. And then, of course, that's when you're getting into problems, because who am I to say what Christie intended? So I understand where it's coming from. I do think that if you have a commitment to keeping the original unedited texts in circulation and available at the outset, I have a lot less of a problem with any of that, because I completely understand where it's coming from. It's basically trying to make these texts more enjoyable in the way they were meant to be enjoyable for more people. And that's wonderful. Like, that's a very commendable sort of an impulse. I completely understand that. I mean, let's not be naive. Obviously, there's a huge, commercial impulse behind that too. I mean, you want people to continue to buy these books and to like the books. And if they're turned off by any of these stuck in their time elements, they might not. But that's okay. Books.
I mean, I'm sure I've read. I'm sure I've read both. Like, I'm sure, because I have copies from all that span. I guess my oldest ones are probably from the 60s. I have a whole pile from the 80s, and I have more recent ones. So, I have the re-releases, and it's really jarring. Like, when you get in there, you're like, oh God.
Yeah, it mars the read. And especially as Americans, we definitely have read edited text, because that's something that Christie herself okayed. She okayed the editing for American audiences of her text. So a lot of those books, from the 80s that I grew up on, I only realized it when I started rereading for the podcast. And we made a commitment, Catherine and I, to ensure that we were reading the original text. And I realized, my Lord Edgeworth Dies, like Lord Edgeworth Dies actually has some horrific anti-Semitism in it. And my copy that I read when I was a kid did not have that. It did not have a lot of those passages in there. And now I think, it's happening more on the Kindle versions for worldwide audiences. And because we all exist on the internet, everyone likes to pretend that these things are only happening for the first time now, so that we can all like freak out about them together. But that's not the case. So obviously this is a perennial issue, and it's one that people have struggled with in different ways. I just appreciate that there are other literary estates that have come out and said, like, we will make sure that the original unedited texts are always available. I don't feel like we've gotten that sense necessarily yet where Christie is concerned. And I would love if we could, so that we just know like where we stand on that. That's sort of a key component that I think still needs to be dealt with. But yeah, I think anyone who has an answer that's coming out too easily on one side or the other hasn't thought deeply enough about it, which is why I completely respect and share your answer.
Yeah, it's tough.
I don't know.
I've probably gone back, and so the ones from the 80s I have are English editions. And just, the new Harper ones are great. They're really well printed and easy to read, but I don't have them all. And so occasionally I would like, I think I have that. Some I picked up, I picked up all over the place. I'm like, I think I have that over here. And I go and you have a little read and you're like, I don't remember that being a thing, which is weird from someone who is so close to getting it. You know what I mean? Like, she's deliberately made a small Belgian man, a refugee, her main protagonist, or an elderly woman. Like, she's definitely like, here's the people you keep underestimating and saying things about. This man is a foreigner, and you constantly make fun of the fact that he's a foreigner and he wears spats and he's a he has some very exacting habits. But you constantly underestimate this man, and you're wrong to do so. Like, the core message of Poirot is like, in terms of a person, like, stop making fun of refugees, you creeps. Like, it's just,
yeah.
So she's so close.
No, I mean, what it really shows is, their blind spots. And I think if you deal with these, it's what I've always tried to do in this podcast. And so many people get angry at the notion of judging these texts at all, because they're like, who are you to judge Agatha Christie's texts? And I understand that. But I think if we're looking at it the right way, we realize these are blind spots. And what makes me think on is, what are my blind spots? Like, because I'm obviously just as fallible as Agatha Christie was. And I'm sure people 50, if anyone was ever listening to this podcast 50 years from now, I'm sure they'd be like, whoa.
Yeah.
I can't believe you said that. We're all going to be judged. I mean, it happens even when you mentioned Mean Girls. Mean Girls, the original Mean Girls from like 2004 is extraordinarily homophobic. And that's not that long ago, because these things, and thank God these things change, because we're an ever evolving group of people. And it's not like we're not becoming better people the more quote unquote current or modern we become. It's just that the mores are shifting and changing. And I think it's helpful to be reminded of that. And it's like a little bit of an injection of humility for me, where I'm like, well, if a genius like Agatha Christie had these blind spots, good God, what are my blind spots? And let me at least have the humility and the introspection to realize that we're all fallible. We all just kind of need to take stock of what we're doing and how we're saying it and who we're affecting.
And recognize that's the water she was drinking. This was the time of eugenics. This was the time of all of these things come from somewhere. This is all in our past. So this is why, there was stuff.
That's in our present too.
That is exactly. Like, that's the reason it's here now too, is that we keep wanting to say we didn't do that or we weren't that. And that we have to keep, a lot of this is like, what monuments do we have to keep up? And that some of them, we have to keep up these statues of Civil War generals. Why? What are you doing? People, the one that always makes me laugh is like, people, well, how else are we going to learn history? Well, first of all, nobody learns history from a statue. That's not how statues work. That's not how history works. And also, we don't keep everything up. That's like saying everything that we've ever built, we have to keep. That's not how anything works. Yeah. And also, those statues are cheap and they're made of old nickels, and they were raised by racists in the 20s, in the teens in the 19-teens during a wave of white nationalism, and are made of garbage, and they're hollow inside, and you can melt them down for nothing. So some monuments, why was the monument built, and should it be kept? And occasionally you can burn it down. And I get to literally burn some stuff down in this book. It was fun.
Yes,
I don't literally set fires, but I can set things on fire in books.
And by the way, I also appreciate you had a fleeting reference to classic mystery author G.K. Chesterton of Father Brown fame for his anti-eugenic stance. I was like, yes, you go, Maureen and G.K. Chesterton.
Yes, a little glance of like G.K. Chesterton was like, not on my watch. So, there we go. There's lots of little nods in there. So if you like mysteries, I kept like dropping little tiny things all over the place. I'm like, just a little treat. Here's a little something for you if you like mysteries like I do.
Oh, you have littered this book with little bonbons. Absolutely. No, I mean, this is as the Truly Devious series was as well. And that's why I said, but even more so, like, it feels a little bit like there's even more of that. It's a little bit more concentrated, I think, in this book, perhaps because it is a standalone. I mean, I was actually going to ask you, I think you already answered the question. Do you have any more stories in store for Marla Wexler? It sounds like no.
No, my plan was that this is I will do other standalones, but this was, that was the plan, is that I wanted a detective and I wanted standalones. There's more. I'm working on Stevie Bell 6 and 7 right now.
That was my next question. You are? Oh,
yes.
Very exciting.
I've already, 6 starts next week, basically. And yes, so 6 and 7 are underway.
Wonderful.
But yeah, I wanted detective and I wanted standalone. And I feel like you get to stand by that.
No, absolutely. And that's so Christie too. I mean, she did both to perfection. And again, and I wish that we could mention the book that you're really referencing, but you're sort of doing an homage to a standalone and doing it right.
Yeah, it's hopefully if you read it, you'll see it.
Oh, absolutely.
It's for you, listener of this particular podcast. It's for you.
Down to even one sort of like the way that the plot wraps up at the end is also like, it's a thorough homage to that book. I also just have to ask, in terms of like ancillaries, are there any film, television adaptations of any of your work that you can tell us about, or you have so much content? So I'm just curious.
There's always stuff in development.
Sure.
It exists in that space of in development. So yes, there's a whole bunch of stuff in development, and whatever that means, it means, obviously things get picked up and developed all the time. And I try to make sure that the ones that go through are good. So I've been pretty strict about some of the stuff I've heard. I've been like, can we try to do this right? Like, let's not turn this into another just like, this is cool, sexy people doing sexy stuff. Like, I'm like, there's a mystery book. Like, let's keep it. Like, for example, they've just done Good Girl's Guide to Murder, and I think they did a good job. Like, yes. I'm like, you did the book, you did the mystery, good. Mm-hmm. So, I've had offerings where they wanted to change it. They're like, it's mystery, but I was like, no. Like, these things I put this together. Like, I built this thing.
I'm just saying,
this mystery.
I would be happy to turn on Netflix and see Stevie Bell up there, get a little Stevie Bell trailer shot directly to my screen, something like that. Hopefully one day.
Well, we'll see.
Something along those lines. Yeah.
The world of development.
As I'm speaking to you here from Los Angeles, believe me, in my previous life as a manager for screenwriters, I know all about the world of development, and it is an interesting, it's a fascinating world, but one from which, it's a little bit like the primordial ooze. It's like every once in a while something bubbles up and it crawls its way out onto land. And you're like, oh wow, okay, and then that's like a movie or a TV show, but otherwise it just kind of continues to bubble and sink and just develop.
While I'd be delighted, I think, because it would depend on how it was done. But like, I write books because I like books, and I'm like, look, I write books. I'm happy with the books just being books. This happens, okay, but that's not where my head's at.
Yeah.
So I like book. I like mystery. So many to read. I do sometimes try to read through the British Library re-released classics, and some of those are, because those are amazing. All those books from the 30s and 40s that have been dug up, and some of them are incredible, and some of them are just a tough go. Like, you really have to like train schedules to get through some of these.
Yes.
You really have to be committed in a way that I didn't know. I was like, oh boy. Oh man, this is really something.
The humdrums. I think they have a category of those, the humdrum books, which are the ones that like the solution relies on having to follow the train schedules. And really, I think was it Freeman Wills Crofts? A lot of his have to do with literally train schedules.
There's one that it was a cross, and I was like, oh boy, I don't like trains enough for this.
It makes you realize just how readable Christie always was, and how much her dialogue sparkles, and what a page turner every single one of her books was, especially compared to a lot of what other people were writing at the same time.
Yeah. If any jokes about train schedules in there, just try this other one and come back and tell me if you have any complaints about mentions of train schedules.
Well, loving your books as books is also, dare I say, a rather Christie-ish answer, but I think that makes a lot of sense. That's the medium you've chosen, and I'm just thrilled to hear that you're working on more Stevie Bell books, which I will 100% be reading. And I think that people will enjoy those books, the Truly Devious books. You will enjoy Death at Morning House. I'm going to include some links in the show notes to you and to the books for anyone who might be interested. And I also really appreciate, what I really wanted out of this conversation was not only to talk about Death at Morning House, but to talk a little bit more globally and generally about YA mystery. And we did, and we got there. And I think I have actually a better appreciation. And I love that simple answer that it's the age of the protagonist, and everything else is as complicated as any other genre of fiction. I mean, it has all of the variety and the complexity that you have everywhere else in literature. That really makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, just read what you want and give it a go. Like, I think you'd be surprised what's out there if you haven't. You don't have to, because you can read what you want, but like, don't be afraid to step in. There's a wide variety of interesting stuff out there.
The water is warm in YA mystery and in any other genre. Absolutely. Maureen, thank you so much for taking the time to talk
with me
today. Maybe we can make this a hat trick, have you on in a couple of years when you've finished a few more of the Stevie Bells, and who knows what you'll move on to after that.
Oh, I have other things in the old personal development soup.
Yes, the primordial ooze of Maureen Johnson.
The ooze.
All right, take care. Thank you again to Maureen Johnson. Always a pleasure, always a trip to speak with Maureen. She's so talented, and I am so grateful that she continues to write in this genre, and I will read anything that she puts out. I really can't wait for those new books in the Truly Devious series. I love that series. For next week's episode, I am bringing on a co-host, Dr. Michelle Kasmer, longtime friend at this point of the podcast. She and I will be discussing the Agatha Christie short story Within a Wall. This is a short story we have not yet discussed on the podcast. There are a few of them left. And there was absolutely no better person in the world to talk to about Within a Wall than Michelle, because she is a super fan of that story. And boy, does it come across in our conversation. Cannot wait to bring that to you. If you'd like more All About Agatha content, you can head on over to the podcast's Patreon page. November's Patreon is a consideration of the 10 standalone titles within the Agatha Christie oeuvre. That's right, there are exactly 10 of them, excluding all of Agatha Christie's series-long detectives. It took a little bit of algebra to get there, but I believe my math checks out. I brought all the patrons through it on the episode. I think it was a really illuminating conversation, but that wasn't all. I also discussed the pre-Christmas short story Back for Christmas by John Collier, a dastardly, devilish little story that had originally been published in The New Yorker in 1939. Very charming, very classic, and I had a lot of fun reading it and discussing it. So head on over to Patreon to check that out. There's a link in the show notes. In the meantime, you can always email me at allaboutthedame@gmail.com. You can find the podcast on Twitter at allaboutthedame and on Instagram at allaboutagatha. You can find me on Facebook at Kemper Donovan Books and at my author website, kemperdonovan.com. If you are in the United States, you can pre-order Loose Lips, the second title in my Ghostwriter mystery series. And there are lots of different territories in which you can buy the first book in my Ghostwriter Mysteries series, The Busybody. I've got links for all of that in the show notes. And as always, any ratings and or reviews that you can provide are greatly appreciated. And I'll see you next time. Bye.